I had always been the one to step up for my family, especially when my brother Percy needed help with his medical bills. But now, out of nowhere, my entitled sister Molly thinks I owe her a penthouse. And if that's not enough, my mother is furious because I refused. Let me take you back a bit. I'm 36, the oldest of three, and then there's Percy, 34, and the youngest, Molly, 28. Growing up, Percy and I had a fairly normal childhood, but Molly? She was treated like royalty. I can only guess it was because she was a surprise baby, and then there's the fact that she was the youngest. Everyone showered her with attention. But I believe that's the root of the problem. Spoiled. That's how she turned out. My dad, he had some sense. He didn't hesitate to reprimand her when she stepped out of line, trying to teach her manners, to no avail. But my mother? She adored her. Molly could do no wrong in her eyes, and woe to anyone who dared call her behavior into question. She tolerated nothing against her precious Molly, not even the tiniest critique. Percy and I? We just learned to endure it. We were so much older than her, and for years, we'd brush off her cruel jabs, telling ourselves it wasn't worth it. But let me tell you, it wasn't easy. As a teenager, Molly had no filter. She'd mock our appearance, claiming she was the most beautiful in the family. And the worst part? We couldn't even argue. She had inherited our mother's good looks. But it wasn't just physical appearance she'd put down. Oh no! She'd make fun of everything we did. Our choices, our futures, nothing was sacred. I remember one Thanksgiving vividly. She told Percy he'd end up a burden on the family, all because he was a literature major. And me? Well, she said if I didn't stop working 12-hour days, I'd never find a boyfriend because no one would want someone who couldn't even take care of themselves. Imagine that. And this wasn't just her teenage angst speaking. No, she had a deeply ingrained sense of entitlement, one that my mother nurtured with laughter and indulgence. If Percy or I ever retaliated, we were told we were too sensitive. Molly could do no wrong. And my mother? She would just laugh it off like it was all a joke. But you could see it in Molly's eyes, she was always dead serious. We hated her for it. And my mother, well, she was the one who allowed it to happen. Then, 8 years ago, our dad passed away. That was when things really started to change. After he was gone, Percy and I began to drift away. Not that Molly and my mother tried to stay close either. Without our father holding everything together, things just fell apart. I didn't need to see them all the time. We barely even saw them on the holidays anymore. Christmas? Maybe if we felt like it. Thanksgiving? Only if it wasn't too much trouble. The distance felt right. My dad was well off, and so was my mother. Percy and I were doing fine on our own. We didn't need them. It became clear there was a wall between us. And I liked it that way. But then, a few weeks ago, I found myself helping Percy out with his medical bills. He'd fractured his ankle, and while insurance covered most of it, there were still the extras, the medications, the physiotherapy, even hiring a nurse to help him while he recovered. He didn't want me to help. He insisted he could cover it, but I could see he was struggling. And I could afford it, no problem. I'm CFO of a company, and we're doing well. So I stepped up. But that was when things took a turn. Molly and my mother found out, and suddenly, I was their personal ATM. They thought I was just going to hand over whatever they asked for, like it was nothing. And that's how I ended up in this mess, right here, right now. 3 days ago, I got a call from Molly while I was at work. She told me she had found a penthouse apartment she really liked and wanted my help paying for it. She was embarrassed to be living with our mother at 28 and wanted to move out. She could only afford half of the apartment's price and was hoping I would cover the rest. She knew I'd helped Percy, and now she expected me to do the same for her. Now, let's get something straight. We had barely spoken for 8 years. Our interactions were sparse and usually forced, out of some obligation. She was cold, distant, and downright rude to us, but now, suddenly, she expected me to help her buy her first apartment? It was like a slap in the face. Molly, a freelance graphic designer, had never been to design school. In fact, she had never worked for anyone but family. Sure, she'd made a few posters for our father's business, but none of them were ever used. Yet she liked to pretend she was some hotshot designer working with exclusive clients. The reality? Those exclusive clients were mostly relatives, and even then, it was only because our mother forced them to give her work. A hobby, at best. It wasn't a job, and it certainly didn't justify her living with our mother until now. I told her, point blank, that I wasn't going to help. She was 28. She could find a real job and pay for the apartment herself. Her response? She said that I had helped Percy, so why couldn't I help her? She argued that he had money, but he was just between jobs. As the oldest sibling, it was my duty to help her, she said. But I wasn't having it. Percy and I had a relationship, one built on respect, one that Molly never bothered to put effort into. I didn't owe her anything. I didn't say it all to her, but I hung up. And the next thing I knew, my mother was on the phone, furious. She went on and on about how unfair we were to poor Molly. How I was playing favorites. She said Molly had already secured the apartment and was just waiting for me to help. The nerve! For as long as I can remember, my mother had always favored Molly, my younger sister, and after our father passed away, it became even more obvious. When Molly wanted to move out and into her own place, she didn't hesitate to ask for help from Uncle, my dad's younger brother. Since my father's death, it had always been clear to me that Uncle would take over the family business. It was always going to be him, and I had already decided long ago that I didn't want to be involved. The pressure of running a business was never something I sought. Percy, my brother, shared my feelings, and neither of us had any desire to carry on with what our father had started. But despite our lack of interest, Uncle stepped up. The business, successful as it was, became his responsibility. My father's shares were transferred to my mother, as per his will, and she continued living comfortably off of that wealth. Yet, the situation wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. Molly, despite all the years that had passed, was still living off of my father's money, and her lavish lifestyle wasn't helping matters. My mother, struggling to keep up with her extravagant habits, was barely able to save. It came down to her asking me for help, yet again. She told me that if she could just help Molly this one time with the apartment, things would improve in the future. She claimed that it was getting harder to support Molly and that she'd soon run out of options. I could barely keep my composure as I listened. It was all I could do not to roll my eyes. I told her bluntly that this wasn't my problem, and she could either encourage Molly to get a real job and manage her finances properly or continue living with her until she was 35. My mother, furious, accused me of being ungrateful. She reminded me that I wouldn't even have the life I had if it weren't for the way they raised me, and now, apparently, I owed them for all the sacrifices they'd made. Her logic made no sense. I stood firm, telling her my decision was final. Before I could end the conversation, she shocked me by threatening to cut me off entirely. The boldness of it caught me off guard. Hadn't she already distanced herself from me for the last 8 years? What difference would going no contact actually make? It didn't matter to me. But I refused to back down. I reminded her, harshly, that after our father passed away, Percy and I accepted that things were never going to be the same, especially since she had made it clear who her favorite was. There was no fairness in it, and I wouldn't pretend there was. She had no right to accuse me of being unfair for showing the same favoritism she had shown all these years. I told her that if she truly wanted to cut ties, I wouldn't stop her. It was what she'd been doing all along, treating us as if we didn't matter, all while placing Molly on a pedestal. I had my own life, and so did Percy. We didn't owe anything to her or Molly. Once I said those words, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was finally out in the open. My mother, enraged, shouted that after everything I'd said, she would never speak to me again. But I couldn't help but laugh, the audacity of her threatening to end something that had already been dead for years. I calmly told her I was perfectly fine with it, and in fact, it might work out better this way. I wouldn't have to invite her to my wedding, and maybe, just maybe, I could make room for someone more deserving. That caught her attention, but before she could respond, I hung up and blocked both her and Molly from my life. The truth was, people like me, ambitious, career-driven women, could find love. I wasn't some lost cause. That's how I met Jackson, 37, the man I've been with for almost 5 years. He knew about the dysfunctional relationship between my mother, Molly, and me, and he'd met them a few times. But he could never fully understand the strain between us. A few weeks ago, after Jackson proposed, we decided to have a small, intimate engagement party to celebrate. We planned to marry in a couple of months, but as the day drew closer, I struggled with whether or not to invite my mother and Molly. I even thought about doing it just to keep the peace, but then, in a moment of clarity, I realized it wasn't necessary. It was almost satisfying to let that go. Then, things took a turn. Yesterday, Jackson received a message from my mother. She said she was incredibly disappointed with me for blocking her and Molly. She told him that, since I had made my stance clear, she and Molly had decided to cut me off permanently. I couldn't understand why they were blaming me. But, for a moment, I felt guilty. I questioned whether I'd done the right thing. Jackson seemed torn. He told me he didn't think I should feel bad about it, but it was clear that, as someone who was so close to his own family, he had a hard time understanding the depth of my relationship with my mother. He only saw what was on the surface. Eventually, I had Percy explain things to Jackson, and once he did, Jackson's view shifted. He said that if his parents ever treated him like my mother treated me, he'd cut them off without hesitation. That settled things. Now, all three of us, Percy, Jackson, and I, had blocked them, and for the first time, I felt a sense of relief. I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't playing the role of a daughter in a family that didn't care about me. I wasn't going to live in a lie. As we moved on from all of that, I realized this confrontation had been long overdue. We had been living a farce for too long. For as long as I could remember, my mother had chosen Molly. Now, Percy and I had chosen peace. It wasn't just a relief, it was a victory. A week later, my uncle contacted me. He told me that my mother had made the decision to transfer half of her shares to Molly and was insisting that Molly have voting power in the company. He thought this was a terrible idea and wanted us to intervene. He explained that while my mother had voting power as a shareholder, she had always refrained from using it, trusting him to run the business. But now, things were changing. My uncle, concerned about the future of the company, didn't want Molly to gain any control, not when she had no business sense whatsoever. He asked us to talk to my mother and convince her not to go through with this plan. It was clear that things were getting complicated, but I couldn't help but feel a certain satisfaction in knowing that the drama was finally catching up with her. I just hoped she could see the damage she was causing before it was too late. If I had been in his shoes, I can honestly say I would have reacted the same way. The thought of Molly, as a shareholder, having voting power in my company? No, I couldn't let that happen. That thought alone unsettled me, so after a quick, intense conversation with Percy, we reached the only conclusion we could: we had to act. We couldn't let this go on any longer, not without doing something. We decided to pay our mother a visit, hoping to speak to her face-to-face about this, because we couldn't just let it slide. Our uncle had been desperate, and we didn't want to let him down. After our father's passing, he had been our rock, looking out for us at every turn. He had always been there when we needed him, a truly decent man who did not deserve to be dragged into such trouble. That's why we made the decision to speak to our mother again, something we had sworn to never do after everything that happened between us. But promises had been made, and this was too important to ignore. We made our way to her house, and of course, Molly was there. As we expected. Her presence alone made the situation far more difficult than it should have been, but we couldn't back down now. We had made a promise, and we needed to keep it. We went to our mother, ignoring Molly's glare, and laid it all out. We told her that we had heard from our uncle about her demand for voting rights in the company, and we were here to tell her, firmly, that this was a terrible idea. At first, she didn't even look up. She just stayed quiet, brushing us off as though we didn't matter. But we weren't going anywhere, and this wasn't just a casual conversation. We repeated ourselves, our voices steady but firm, insisting that she couldn't keep ignoring us on something this serious. Finally, she glanced up, her expression icy. "You have no right to tell me what to do," she snapped. "After everything that's happened between us, I don't care to hear from you too. Leave." Then, just as we were about to react, Molly entered the room, making her presence even more infuriating. She didn't hold back, telling us that if our mother wanted to be involved in the company our father built, something neither of us had shown interest in, then we had no right to act as though we owned the place now. Her voice dripped with sarcasm, making it harder for me to stay calm. But I tried, oh, how I tried to keep my composure. I didn't want to blow this. I tried to reason with our mother, explaining that our father, even when he was alive, had been very clear about his wishes. He didn't want us involved in the company, and he trusted only his brother after him to make decisions. If Uncle said Molly couldn't be part of it, that should be the end of the story. I begged her to think about our father's wishes. If you go against this, I said, you'll be dishonoring him. For a moment, there was silence. The room felt heavy with tension, and for the first time, I thought she might be considering it. But before we could breathe a sigh of relief, Molly, realizing the stakes, went on the offensive. She lashed out, accusing me of wanting to cut them off for good, threatening to call the cops if we didn't leave. She claimed that I had made it clear we weren't family anymore, so why should I even be there? Percy, stepping in to protect me, told Molly to back off, his voice firm but steady. Meanwhile, I kept my focus on our mother. I could feel I was getting through to her. Dad worked tirelessly to build that company, I said, and he didn't want this kind of drama after he was gone. We all agreed to respect that. That's why I left the family business in the first place, because I didn't want to disrespect him. But Molly kept screaming, accusing me of jealousy, claiming I couldn't bear to see her happy. You're trying to stop Mom from getting involved because you're bitter, she yelled. But our mother remained silent. She stayed still, as if the weight of it all was finally sinking in. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, but it wasn't what we wanted to hear. Shut up, she said, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. I'll think about it, and I'll let your uncle know. But for now, you both need to leave. You've been disrespectful, and I've had enough. And just like that, we were dismissed. Forced to leave. But Molly stayed behind, and Percy and I could only pray that our mother's mind would change, that she would see sense and back away from her plan. I spoke to Jackson afterward, and he said that despite our strained relationship with our mother, we had done our best. Now, it was out of our hands. All we could do was tell our uncle that we tried. I relayed the situation to him, and he wasn't optimistic. No word from our mother yet, but we could only hope she would come to her senses. 2 weeks later, we received the news we'd been waiting for. After much deliberation, our mother finally made her decision. Molly wouldn't get voting rights in the company, but our mother had transferred some of her own shares to her. Molly was getting preferred shares, which would give her a stable income. I was relieved, at least the company wasn't going to sink because of her, but it wasn't exactly a victory. As for my relationship with our mother, it hadn't improved. Percy and I still hadn't heard a word from her. And I was okay with that. What's more, I had spoken to some relatives who clarified that, despite what people might think, our father had left assets to Percy, Molly, and me, though there weren't shares in the company. That fact seemed to clear things up for a few, though some still believed otherwise. I knew people expected me to speak ill of my father, but that wasn't what I wanted. He wasn't perfect, but I wanted to remember him in the best light possible, not drag his memory through the mud. So, for those out there who thought I was making him out to be a saint, let me assure you, I wasn't. Months passed, and there was still no contact with Molly or our mother. And honestly, we were better for it. No more toxicity, no more chaos. And now, I was preparing to marry the love of my life. The invitations had been sent, and of course, neither Molly nor our mother had received one. Not that I expected them to care. But when they found out they weren't invited, they lost it. They tried to rally the rest of the family to their side, demanding that no one attend my wedding, but so far, no one's taking them seriously. It was almost comical to watch. They thought they could exert some control, but the truth was, they were already losing their grip. My mother had even rented out our old house and moved into a penthouse apartment with Molly. They pretended to be helping each other, but anyone with eyes could see through their act. They were both playing their parts in a story they had created, each portraying themselves as the victim. But, for Percy and me, life had never been better. Percy's magazine was thriving, and I was about to marry the woman I loved. Everything Molly had said about us was wrong, and we were living proof that her manipulation hadn't worked. So, in the end, it was her loss.